The fluorescent lights in the Horizon Pharma lab buzzed overhead, their sound an incessant hum that filled the air like a trapped wasp, its wings beating against the confines of the sterile environment. The glow from above bathed the rows of pill bottles and untouched spreadsheets in an almost clinical light, making everything seem too neat, too controlled, as though reality itself had been boxed into this tight, unyielding space. Dr. Elena Marlowe, once a towering figure in the world of pharmaceutical innovation, stood at the edge of the lab, her eyes scanning the space. She adjusted the hem of her lab coat, a deliberate motion that momentarily pulled her out of the cold precision of the lab and back into her own skin. Her fingers brushed lightly against the fake ID badge pinned to her chest. It read Claire Evans, a carefully crafted identity that now served as her shield. A new intern just starting out in quality control. No one could ever guess who she truly was, not with her hair dyed chestnut, a far cry from the platinum blonde she'd once worn as a badge of power, nor with the scrubs from a thrift store clinging awkwardly to her frame, replacing the sharp, tailored suits that had once marked her as the CEO of Horizon Pharma. As she walked through the lab, Elena couldn't help but notice the way people avoided her gaze, too busy with their own tasks to acknowledge the intern who now stood among them. The mask she wore, both physical and metaphorical, was working. Her own employees didn't recognize her, and that was exactly the way she needed it to be. Horizon Pharma had once been her dream, built from the ground up in the confines of a garage, a place where ambition and determination had pushed her to create something bigger than anyone had dared imagine. The startup had grown, flourished, and transformed into a billion-dollar empire. She had been the mastermind, the driving force behind it all. But with success had come shadows, whispers in the hallways and in the press. Whispers of price gouging, of rushed drug approvals, of patients crushed under the weight of their medical bills. Horizon Pharma, once a beacon of hope in the industry, was now a symbol of greed, and Elena couldn't escape the suffocating grip of its reputation. The lab felt suffocating, its sterile environment a reflection of the world she had helped create. She'd seen the reports, heard the complaints, read the accusations. She could no longer ignore the growing murmur of discontent, the whispers that had grown louder with each passing day. They had become a chorus, a reminder of the decisions she had made, the compromises she had accepted. Every pill bottle on the shelf felt like a reminder of the lives that had been touched and damaged by those choices. But Elena was no longer the CEO. She wasn't the woman who had once made the tough decisions from her polished office high above the city. Now she was just Claire Evans, an intern with no power and no voice. She had stepped into the shadows of her own empire, seeking answers to questions that had begun to haunt her in the dead of night. What had she really built? And at what cost? As the minutes passed, Elena's mind raced, and the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder, more oppressive, as though the building itself was trying to remind her of everything she had lost. But this wasn't a time for self-pity. It was a time for reckoning. She had come here to confront the truth, not the truth that had been twisted and manipulated by the media, but the raw, unfiltered truth buried beneath layers of corporate gloss. Her gaze shifted to the small desk in the corner, where the lab technician sat, engrossed in his work. His eyes flicked up briefly, meeting hers, and for a fraction of a second, Elena saw something there. Recognition. A hint of curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of suspicion. But just as quickly it was gone. He turned his attention back to his work as though nothing had happened. As though Elena, or rather Claire Evans, was nothing more than another nameless intern in a sea of faces. She exhaled slowly, trying to shake the feeling of being invisible, of being trapped in a world she had created. But it was impossible to shake off the weight of it all. There was no going back now. Horizon Pharma was her legacy, for better or for worse. And no amount of scrubbing away at her identity would change that fact. With a final glance around the sterile lab, Elena straightened her shoulders and walked toward the back office. She had a lot of work to do, and not just in the lab. The answers she sought were out there, buried in the labyrinth of corporate greed and deceit. And she would find them no matter what it took. Her first clue came at lunch, when the sterile hum of the lab seemed miles away, replaced by the more familiar, more human noises of the break room. The low murmur of voices, the clink of plastic forks against microwave trays, the sharp hiss of the coffee machine. But it was the conversation between two lab technicians that caught Elena's ear, cutting through the chatter like a knife. "Did you hear about the Leighton trial?" one of them muttered, her voice thick with disbelief. Elena's hand froze halfway to her cup, the bitter taste of the coffee suddenly turning to acid in her throat. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her composure, but every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to walk away. The Leighton trial. She knew all about it, knew that Horizon had been pushing the new drug for months, marketing it as the next miracle cure. The company's hopes were riding on it, the press releases already touting the trial as a major success. But she knew better. She knew how easily the truth could be buried under layers of corporate gloss, how the numbers could be massaged and the side effects swept under the rug. And now, it seemed, the whispers had made their way into the break room. "They're burying the side effects." "Again?" the technician continued, her tone laced with frustration. The second technician snorted, her voice dripping with cynicism. "What's new? Profit over people, right?" Elena's stomach twisted. The words hit her harder than she expected, the weight of them pressing down on her chest. She could hear the bitterness in their voices, the resignation. It wasn't just the side effects they were talking about, it was the system. The very system she had helped build. The system that valued money over human lives. That had become her legacy. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the edge. She took a shaky sip, trying to swallow away the taste of guilt that lingered in her mouth. The lab techs went on, oblivious to her presence, but Elena's mind was already spiraling. How deep did the corruption run? How many trials like Leighton had been pushed through the system, the truth hidden behind a veil of corporate jargon and public relations campaigns? How many patients had suffered in silence, their pain dismissed in favor of Horizon's bottom line? The world she had built, the empire she had nurtured, was beginning to unravel before her eyes, piece by piece. And as much as she wanted to deny it, as much as she longed to cling to the belief that she had always done what was best for the people, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The truth that had been there all along, buried beneath the weight of profits and quarterly reports. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, Elena Marlowe felt small. She set the coffee cup down, her hands shaking, and turned toward the exit. There was no turning back now. She couldn't unhear what she'd just heard. And more importantly, she couldn't pretend any longer that she didn't know what was happening at Horizon Pharma. The truth was calling, and it was louder than ever. By week 2, Elena had seen enough. The disorganization, the shortcuts, the deliberate negligence, it was all too much to ignore. Vials were mislabeled, and the discrepancies in the testing reports grew harder to overlook with each passing day. Safety reports that should have been meticulously filed were lost or misplaced, and no one seemed to care. The interns, the technicians, even the senior staff, everyone was too busy, too complacent, or too afraid to challenge the system. It was a pattern she'd seen before, but never from this side of the desk. Each discovery felt like a small crack in the foundation of the empire she had built. It was as if she were watching her own creation rot from the inside out, and no matter how hard she tried to focus on the task at hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that the whole operation was teetering on the edge of collapse. Then came the day she met Mrs. Delaney. The elderly woman had been waiting in the lobby for what seemed like hours, her frail figure hunched over in a wheelchair, her eyes clouded with a mixture of frustration and fear. Her name had been on the intake sheet for weeks, and yet no one had gotten around to processing her request. Elena had seen her name on the schedule but hadn't given it much thought. Another patient, another number in the endless cycle of corporate promises. But something in Mrs. Delaney's expression caught Elena off guard. There was an urgency in her eyes, a quiet desperation that seemed to cut through the sterile walls of Horizon Pharma like a razor. Elena couldn't ignore it, not this time. She approached the woman cautiously, her voice soft and soothing. "Mrs. Delaney?" she asked, trying to keep her tone neutral, though she could feel her pulse quickening. "How can I help you?" The old woman looked up, her gaze searching Elena's face as if trying to place her. "I need help," she said, her voice trembling, though there was a fire in her words. "My husband. He took the new medication, the Leighton drug. They said it was safe. But he's been getting worse. His health, his heart, it's failing. They told me it was nothing, just side effects. But I know it's not." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. The Leighton drug was supposed to be the shining star of Horizon Pharma's portfolio, her portfolio. It was supposed to be a success, a testament to everything Horizon stood for. But here was this woman, desperate for answers, holding on to the hope that someone, anyone, would listen. The same woman whose husband's life had been sacrificed on the altar of corporate greed. Mrs. Delaney's eyes filled with tears. "They won't listen to me. They've been treating us like we're crazy. But I know my husband. I know something's wrong. He's not the same. He can't breathe. He can't walk. And every time I call, they just send me to voicemail. No one cares." The words hit Elena like a punch to the gut. She could feel her chest tighten, the weight of Mrs. Delaney's pain pressing down on her. In that moment, Elena realized that this wasn't just about faulty vials or misplaced reports anymore. This was about real people, people who were being harmed by the very company she had built, people who were paying the price for her ambition, for her decisions. Her mind raced. How many other patients were out there like Mrs. Delaney's husband? How many others had been told that their suffering was just a side effect, a temporary inconvenience? How many had been discarded, their voices drowned out by the cacophony of corporate interests? Mrs. Delaney's voice cracked as she continued, "I just want someone to look at him. I just want someone to see what's happening." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen the reports, the clinical trials, the polished marketing materials. She had seen all the data that promised safety, efficiency, and hope. But now, standing in front of this woman, Elena felt the full weight of her choices. She had turned a blind eye for too long. And now, the consequences were staring her in the face. "I'll make sure someone looks into it," Elena said, her voice a little firmer than she intended, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I'll personally see to it." Mrs. Delaney gave her a weak smile, but there was no joy in it. Only weariness. "Thank you. Thank you." Elena watched the old woman being escorted out of the building, her heart heavy with the realization that this was only the beginning. Horizon Pharma had become a machine, a faceless entity that cared more about profits than the people who depended on its products. And she had been the one to build it. As she stood there, staring at the empty lobby, Elena knew she couldn't keep ignoring the truth. The pieces were falling into place and there was no turning back now. She had to fix this before it was too late for anyone else. The woman stood in Horizon's patient assistant's office, her knuckles white as they gripped the worn handle of a cane. Her son, a lanky teen with hollow eyes and a sullen expression, slouched beside her, his shoulders heavy with a weariness beyond his years. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his oversized hoodie, eyes downcast, too defeated to even look up. "Please," she pleaded, her voice shaky with the exhaustion of a mother pushed to the edge. "The price doubled overnight. Jake's epilepsy meds, we can't." Her words trailed off as if even speaking them aloud made them more real, more impossible. The manager behind the desk, too well-fed, too smug in his sterile office, looked at her with a detached amusement, his lips curling into a smirk. The kind of smirk that had become all too familiar in this place. "You understand," he said, his voice dripping with the practiced empathy that came with years of denying people like her, "that these changes are necessary to maintain the company's operations. Drug costs fluctuate all the time. It's just how things work." The woman's face tightened, her grip on the cane tightening to the point that her knuckles bled white. She was fighting back tears, but the desperation in her eyes shone through, a raw plea for help. "We can't afford it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't. Jake. He needs the medication. Without it, he has seizures, he doesn't even remember what happens during them. And now you're telling me we can't afford it? How are we supposed to live with that?" Jake, the teenager who had barely said a word since they entered the office, finally lifted his head. His gaze was hollow, the weight of the situation pressing down on him in a way that no teenager should have to feel. He looked at his mother, then at the manager, and his voice was barely audible, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "Mom? We're not gonna make it, are we?" The manager's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, turning back to his computer screen and tapping a few keys, as though he hadn't just watched a mother and son fall apart in front of him. "There's nothing I can do, ma'am," he said flatly, as if the words were rehearsed. "I'm afraid our hands are tied. You'll have to apply for the assistance program, but even then it could take weeks for anything to process. If you want to wait, we'll let you know." The woman's face crumpled, her hands trembling at her sides. The pain, the frustration, the complete helplessness, it was all there in her eyes. She looked back at Jake, whose face mirrored her own, full of hopelessness. He'd given up hope, and for good reason. The system was failing them both. Elena, who had been standing just inside the doorway, frozen in place as she watched the exchange unfold, felt her heart lurch painfully in her chest. She could hear the whispers of the past week in her mind, the rumors about the price hikes, the reports about Horizon's skyrocketing profits. The very drugs they needed to survive were being held hostage by the price tag attached to them. The realization hit her with a force that left her reeling. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a glitch in the system or a mistake, it was the system. A system built on profit margins and shareholder satisfaction, where people like Mrs. Delaney and her son were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. "Wait," Elena said, her voice suddenly steady, her resolve hardening. The manager glanced up at her, clearly surprised by the interruption. "I'll take care of it," she said, her eyes narrowing. Get Mrs. Delaney the medication her son needs. Right now. The manager's eyes widened, but he didn't challenge her. There was something in her gaze, something unyielding that made him hesitate. After a long, tense pause, he finally sighed and turned toward his computer, fingers tapping at the keys with an air of reluctant compliance. Elena stepped forward, standing beside Mrs. Delaney, offering her a small, reassuring smile. You don't have to wait. I'll make sure this gets taken care of. Mrs. Delaney's face softened with disbelief, but gratitude bloomed in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, the words coming out like a prayer. Elena didn't respond. Instead, she kept her gaze on the manager, who was now processing the paperwork under her watchful eye. As the minutes stretched on, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. This was no longer about the discrepancies in reports or the internal corruption. It was about real people, real lives, and the choices she had made to turn a blind eye for so long. She turned her attention back to the mother and son. They were just two faces in a sea of countless others, but in this moment, Elena knew she had to make it right. Not just for them but for everyone who had fallen victim to the system she had built. And in that moment, Elena made a promise to herself. She would change Horizon Pharma, no matter the cost. Not our policy, the manager interrupted coldly, his fingers still hovering over the keyboard as though the conversation had already been decided. Take the generic. Mrs. Delaney's face crumpled in a mix of anger and helplessness. The generic doesn't work for him. Her voice cracked, thick with the weight of every night spent holding her son through seizures. He'll have seizures, he'll. Her words faltered as she choked on the fear, her chest heaving with the effort of containing the panic that had been building for days, for weeks. It was clear that the generic alternative wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a risk to her son's health, a gamble that no mother should have to make. Before Elena could stop herself, she stepped forward, the pull of urgency overriding her hesitation. Her eyes met the manager's for a split second, sharp, steady, and she ignored the familiar prickle of discomfort that came with confronting him in this sterile, corporate space. What's the drug? Elena asked, her voice cutting through the tension with a force that surprised even her. The manager paused, looking up from his screen with a trace of annoyance. Excuse me? Elena didn't waver. What's the drug? She repeated, her tone commanding. The one that your company is doubling the price of? I want to know the name. For a brief moment, the manager's expression flickered, surprise, maybe even recognition, but it was quickly replaced by the practiced indifference that Elena had grown all too familiar with over the years. He sighed and muttered the name, almost under his breath, as if saying it aloud somehow made it less real. Keppra, he said, eyes avoiding hers. Elena's stomach sank. Keppra. The very drug Mrs. Delaney's son needed to control his epilepsy, the drug that Horizon had recently raised the price of. It was a staple in the industry, one of the most prescribed medications for seizure disorders. And now, it was another tool in the company's arsenal to increase profits at the expense of patients like Jake, patients who had no choice but to depend on Horizon's products for survival. She turned to Mrs. Delaney, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of hope and fear. I'll make sure you get the medication you need. Right now. Her voice was firm, but she could feel the weight of the words settle on her shoulders. She knew she couldn't fix everything, but for this mother, this family, she had to do something. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but Elena cut him off, her gaze hardening. I said I'll make sure you get it. She turned back to Mrs. Delaney, offering a look of quiet reassurance. Wait here. As she walked toward the back office, she could hear the manager muttering something under his breath, no doubt trying to get in the last word, but Elena wasn't listening. The wheels were already turning in her mind. This wasn't about policy, it was about doing what was right. It was about taking back control from the greed that had so easily taken over the company she had once built. Elena knew the system. She knew how to play the game. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't interested in playing. She wasn't interested in excuses or bureaucratic nonsense. She was going to get that medication for Jake no matter what it took. She walked out of the office with a new fire in her chest, determined to make this right no matter the cost. The manager glared at Elena, his lips curling into a sneer. None of your business, Claire, he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain, as though he were doing her a favor by even allowing her to stand there. But Elena didn't back down. She didn't look at him. Instead, her attention was on Mrs. Delaney, whose face was lined with exhaustion, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. The old woman leaned forward slightly, as though the words she was about to speak might be the last lifeline she had left. Ventrixil, Mrs. Delaney said, her voice cracking under the weight of the admission. They want $1,200 a month. Elena's stomach dropped, the blood draining from her face. The figure felt like a punch to the gut. $1,200 a month. For epilepsy medication. For a drug that, in its raw form, could likely cost a fraction of that. She tried to steady her breath, but the anger bubbling inside her was immediate, sharp. Ventrixil. It wasn't a new drug. It wasn't some breakthrough that justified an astronomical price tag. No, Ventrixil was another example of corporate exploitation, a medication whose production cost was a mere $30 per month. $30. The markup was outrageous, the price gouging blatant. And here it was, right in front of her, the very thing she had been blind to, the very thing she had ignored in the name of profit. Her mind raced, the numbers, the costs, the realities crashing down around her. She had been complicit in this. Horizon had raised prices with the full knowledge of the impact it would have on families like Mrs. Delaney's, on people like Jake, who needed the medication to live. The numbers didn't lie. The greed didn't lie. And it sickened her. Elena fought to keep her voice steady, but the edge of fury was unmistakable. "This isn't right," she said, her words low but filled with conviction. She turned toward the manager, her eyes sharp, her face a mask of determination. "You don't get to do this. Not anymore." The manager's smirk returned, but there was something nervous in his eyes now, something that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. He opened his mouth to argue, but Elena cut him off. "I'm not asking for your permission. Get the Delaney's their medication. Now." The manager's face flushed with anger, but for a moment, Elena saw a flicker of uncertainty. The world she had created, the carefully crafted persona of corporate power and unyielding rules, was beginning to fracture. And she, Elena Marlowe, was the one responsible for breaking it open. Mrs. Delaney, still standing beside her son, blinked in disbelief as though she could hardly comprehend what was happening. You'll really help us." Her voice was thick with hope, but there was a fragility to it, as though she wasn't sure if she could truly trust the promise. Elena nodded, her resolve hardening with every second that passed. "I'll get this fixed. I promise." The manager finally stood, clearly irritated but too afraid to challenge her further. He shuffled to his desk and, with a reluctant sigh, began typing furiously at his computer, pulling up the necessary paperwork. He didn't dare meet Elena's eyes. Elena glanced at Mrs. Delaney and Jake one last time, her mind already on the next steps. The next battle. This was just the start, and she wouldn't stop until things were right. As she walked out of the office, Mrs. Delaney's quiet words followed her, a whisper of gratitude in the air. "Thank you. Thank you for listening." But Elena didn't respond. She couldn't. The fire inside her burned too brightly, too intensely, to say anything but the truth she already knew. This was no longer just about fixing one wrong. It was about fixing an entire system. And she wasn't going to stop until she tore it down. That night, Elena stormed into her own boardroom, her fury palpable, her steps heavy with determination. The fluorescent lights above flickered in response to the charge in the air as she threw open the door with a force that made the entire room go still. She had shed the disguise, the hair dye, the fake badge, the lab coat. There was no more hiding behind any version of herself. The woman standing in front of the board now was no longer Claire Evans, the intern. She was Elena Marlowe, the CEO, and she had seen enough. The giant screen at the far end of the room blinked to life, illuminating the somber faces of the executives sitting around the polished conference table. Security footage played in crisp detail, the image of the manager laughing as Mrs. Delaney, the fragile woman with the cane, wept quietly in the corner of Horizon Pharma's patient assistance office. It was a scene that made Elena's blood boil. Her own company, her own empire, was laying waste to families in the name of profit. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some leaning back in their chairs, others crossing their arms defensively. None of them dared speak, but their eyes darted from one another, trying to gauge the mood, trying to determine if this was just another routine meeting or if something more was happening. But Elena wasn't interested in their fear or hesitation. She wasn't here to make small talk. "Who approved this?" Elena's voice rang out, cold and sharp, like the crack of ice. It could have frozen hell itself. Her gaze swept across the room, piercing every single one of the executives with an intensity that made them squirm in their seats. No one answered. Elena stepped forward, her heels clicking on the cold tile floor with each deliberate step. "Oh, approved. This?" she repeated, her voice now low and lethal. The silence stretched out, suffocating and unbearable, until the head of the marketing department, a man named Gerald, finally broke under the pressure. It was a company-wide decision. he stammered, his voice quivering. The price increase, it was approved by the board after the quarterly report came in. We had to. Elena held up a hand, cutting him off. I don't care about your reports, she spat, her words dripping with contempt. I care about people. Mrs. Delaney is not some statistic you can manipulate. Jake is not just another number to pad your margins. She paced the length of the room, her hands trembling at her sides, but the anger in her chest was enough to keep her steady. You took a life-saving medication and inflated the price by 1,200%. And for what? So you could increase the company's profit margins? So you could report record earnings while families like hers are left to drown in debt. Her voice grew louder with each word, each accusation she hurled at them, each piece of their carefully constructed empire that she tore down in an instant. The room was completely still, the executives now staring at the table, avoiding her gaze as though it were the very thing that might shatter them. But Elena didn't care about their guilt. She cared about the truth, and the truth was that they had all been complicit in this greed. She stopped pacing and faced them, her back straight, her expression hard. What you saw in that footage? That laughing manager? He's a reflection of everything that's wrong with this company. And I built it. I allowed it to get to this point. That ends tonight. A ripple of discomfort moved through the boardroom. Elena could see it in their faces, could feel the shift in the room. They had been riding the high of success for so long that they had forgotten what it was like to be human, to care about the people they were supposed to be serving. I'm going to fix this, Elena said, her voice cold and unyielding. And anyone who gets in my way is going to be held accountable. You can either help me right this wrong or you can walk out that door and never come back. No one moved. The tension was thick, palpable. But as Elena stood there, unwavering, her eyes locked on each of them, she knew that the moment had come. The moment to reclaim her company, to rebuild it from the broken foundation it had become. Get ready, she said, her voice quiet but full of iron. We're going to take this company back. We're going to be a company that serves people, not profits. And if you're not on board with that, then this will be your last meeting. She turned on her heel, her heart pounding in her chest. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Silence enveloped the room once more, thick and suffocating. Elena's words had struck deep, but it wasn't until the CFO cleared his throat nervously that anyone dared break it. Elena, our investors, he began, his voice shaky, trying to steer the conversation back to safer waters, away from the brutal truth she had just laid bare. But Elena was done with safe. She was done with politeness. The weight of everything she'd ignored for so long was now too much to carry. She slammed a spreadsheet down onto the polished conference table with a force that made everyone flinch, the paper crinkling with the impact. It was the kind of dramatic gesture that felt small compared to the magnitude of the truth it represented. She didn't care. Let them flinch. Our mission was to save lives, she thundered, her voice vibrating with the force of the words, as if saying them out loud would reawaken the purpose that had been long buried beneath corporate greed. Not line our pockets and play these games with people's lives. You think I didn't track the kickbacks? The offshore accounts? The money flowing into the pockets of people who don't care about the people who rely on our products to survive. She didn't wait for them to respond. Her pulse raced, blood rushing in her ears. The CFO's face turned pale as the tension in the room ramped up, but he still tried to regain control. Elena, please. The investors. Elena's voice cracked through the air like thunder. You think I didn't see the numbers in the background? You think I didn't know about the offshore accounts that funneled money away from the people who needed it most? You think I didn't watch as we priced people out of life-saving medication just so we could keep stock prices high and investors happy? Those kickbacks are killing us. The CFO's hands tightened around the armrest of his chair, but he said nothing, his eyes dropping to the table in an attempt to avoid Elena's piercing stare. But Elena didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now, not when the truth had exploded to the surface. You want to talk about investors? Fine, she said, her voice steadying but still fierce. But I'll tell you this, those investors don't care about our mission. They don't care about saving lives. They care about their dividends. They care about their quarterly earnings reports. They care about nothing but their bottom line. And we've been the ones selling out. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table, her gaze never wavering from the group before her. I built this company and somewhere along the way I lost sight of what it was meant to do. But that ends tonight. If we want to salvage anything, if we want to repair the damage we've done, we stop catering to the investors and start caring about the people we've harmed. A few of the executives exchanged nervous glances, the weight of her words sinking in, each of them now fully aware that their world was on the verge of collapse. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Elena wasn't just the CEO in title anymore. She was the force driving this change, and none of them could deny it. For a long moment, the room was completely still. Then, the marketing director, one of the few who hadn't yet retreated behind his self-protective shell, leaned forward. His voice was tentative but steady. What? What do we do now? Elena straightened up, her shoulders back, the fire still burning behind her eyes. She didn't hesitate. We fix it, she said simply. We undo the damage. We start with the pricing. We take the generic options off the table and provide the medication at the price it costs to produce it. No more gouging. No more tricks. If we're going to keep Horizon Pharma alive, we need to change our entire approach, starting with transparency. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It was the beginning of something new. A shift. Elena could feel it in the air, something was changing. She could see the doubt in their eyes, but also a hint of something else. The smallest spark of understanding, maybe even acceptance. And she wasn't going to let that spark go out. We'll fix it. And we'll do it the right way. Elena's voice was low now, but resolute. But it's not going to be easy. Some of you might not be able to stay. Some of you may have to face the consequences for what's been allowed to happen here. Her eyes swept the room one last time, meeting each executive's gaze. But for those of you who want to make things right, those of you who still remember why we started this company, let's get to work. The tension in the room broke, slowly at first, but then as Elena stood there, unwavering, a sense of resolution began to settle in. Some of them might have doubted her, but she knew that she had set the stage for a battle that Horizon Pharma couldn't ignore. And this time she was going to fight for something that truly mattered: the people. The room froze. The weight of Elena's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The silence was thick, pregnant with the aftermath of everything she had just unleashed. The executives sat frozen in their seats, their eyes wide, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. But Elena, despite the tumult of her emotions, remained calm. She had made her decision and she was moving forward. There was no turning back. By dawn, the first steps were already in motion. The manager who had so callously laughed at Mrs. Delaney's desperation was fired, his office cleared out, his badge deactivated. It was swift, brutal, and necessary. Elena wasn't just making symbolic gestures, she was taking action. Mrs. Delaney's son, Jake, would have his medication for free for life. Elena personally signed the papers, making sure there was no room for hesitation, no room for another bureaucratic delay. Horizon Pharma owed that woman, owed every person they had wronged, and Elena wasn't about to let them get away with it any longer. But Elena knew that these were just small victories in a much larger battle. The pricing team, those responsible for the appalling hikes in medication costs, was immediately placed under audit. She made sure the wheels of scrutiny began turning as soon as possible, as though there was no room for doubt. Every spreadsheet, every calculation, every decision made by that team would be examined under the brightest lights, and the answers would be found. She wasn't going to let them continue to exploit the very people Horizon was supposed to serve. Still, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. As the sun rose and the first light of day filtered through the blinds of the boardroom, she knew the rot went deeper than just a handful of bad decisions, a few corrupt players. This wasn't just about one manager or a single team. The entire foundation of Horizon Pharma, the empire she had built, the empire she had allowed to decay into something monstrous, was tainted. There were more problems hidden in the shadows. Kickbacks, offshore accounts, bribery. She had known about some of it, but she had closed her eyes when the whispers reached her ears. She had been too focused on the next big deal, the next product launch, the next wave of profits. And now, those decisions were coming back to haunt her. She couldn't undo everything in one night. But the next few days would be critical. The audit was just the start, but Elena needed more. She needed to cut out the rot at its source, expose the cancer that had spread throughout the company. And she needed to be sure, absolutely sure, that this wasn't just a public relations stunt, that it wasn't just another patch to cover the cracks in Horizon's facade. Elena stood by the window looking out at the city below, the bustling streets full of people unaware of the war that was raging behind the closed doors of Horizon Pharma. The night had been a victory. But the war? That was still ahead. The truth was bigger than she could have imagined, and the stakes had never been higher. She wasn't just fighting for Horizon anymore. She was fighting for the future of the people it was supposed to help. And she wasn't going to stop until the rot was gone, until she had rebuilt this company from the ground up. It would take everything. And she was ready. Enter NextGen Pharma, Horizon's fiercest rival. NextGen had always lurked in the shadows, but now, under the leadership of Carter Voss, they were a force to be reckoned with. Voss was the epitome of corporate charm, slick, polished, with a perpetual smile that made him the darling of industry galas and investor meetings. He had mastered the art of playing the part of the benevolent CEO, always a hand on the shoulder, always shaking the right hands, but beneath the surface, there was no pretending. Voss's rise had been built on the same ruthless foundation of corporate greed, and his company had become notorious for hiking prices on critical cancer drugs, while the rest of the world watched helpless. But when Elena slashed Horizon's prices, when she took a stand and began making real changes, Voss felt the sting. Horizon's newfound commitment to lowering drug prices, putting people before profits, was a direct threat to NextGen's bottom line. Voss couldn't allow that kind of disruption to continue unchecked. He retaliated. The first move was subtle but damaging. Fake FDA complaints began circulating, alleging that Horizon had cut corners in the production of certain medications. The claims were groundless, but they were enough to cast doubt on Horizon's commitment to safety and quality. Elena's team scrambled to respond, but the damage had already been done. Whispers had begun, and once that seed was planted, it was nearly impossible to erase. Next, Voss's team began poaching Horizon's top sales reps, offering them lucrative deals and promises of a brighter future at NextGen. It was a classic move, undermine your competition by siphoning off its talent, but it worked. One by one, key players from Horizon's sales team left, swelling NextGen's ranks with experienced professionals who knew the market, knew the customers, and most importantly, knew Horizon's weaknesses. But Voss wasn't done. Then came the anonymous tip to the press: Horizon faked trial data. The accusation hit like a bombshell. The press devoured it, and within hours the story was everywhere. Headlines screamed about Horizon's fraudulent activities, about the manipulations of clinical trial results to gain quicker approval for drugs, to push products to market faster and more profitably. The story seemed too perfect to be anything but true. And with the growing number of complaints, the swirling rumors, and now the press coverage, Horizon's name was tarnished beyond repair. Elena felt the blow as if it were a physical strike. She had been so focused on making things right that she hadn't anticipated the full force of the retaliation from NextGen. The story about the fake trial data was the one thing Horizon couldn't easily escape. There was no way to deny it without a full investigation, and even then the damage had been done. Trust had been shattered. But Elena wasn't one to back down. The pressure was mounting on all sides: media, investors, the public, but she wasn't going to let Voss take her company down without a fight. She didn't just have to fight for Horizon anymore, she had to fight for the very principles she had instilled in it. If Voss thought he could take her down with dirty tricks and smear campaigns, he was about to find out just how far Elena was willing to go to protect everything she'd worked for. And she wasn't about to play by the same rules. "Prepare for war," Elena said, her voice steady but cold as she stood in front of her team, her gaze unwavering. "We will take this head on. We will expose Voss and NextGen for what they really are." She didn't need to say more. The message was clear. Horizon Pharma was going to fight back, not just in the courtrooms or in the press, but on the front lines of truth, where integrity was the only weapon that mattered. Elena's board was in full panic mode. The accusations were spiraling, and the pressure was suffocating. Investors were starting to pull out. The stock was plummeting. The only thing they could think to do was try to control the damage by settling, by burying the truth under a mountain of legalese and corporate spin. "Settle," they urged, their voices shaking. "We can't afford this kind of hit. Protect the stock, Elena. If we let it go on any longer, we're done." But Elena wasn't listening. She wasn't interested in hiding behind a settlement or corporate maneuvers. The truth was out there, and Horizon had nothing to be ashamed of. It wasn't about protecting the company's value, it was about protecting the people who relied on Horizon's medications. Instead of caving to the pressure, Elena took a step that would change everything. She stormed into Lab 4, the very heart of Horizon's research and development, the room where so many of the company's promises had been made. The cameras were rolling, and Elena knew this was her moment, her one chance to take control of the narrative. She grabbed a vial of Ventrixil, the very drug at the center of the controversy, and held it up to the camera. "Test Ventrixil yourselves," she said, her voice steady but passionate. "I'm opening up the entire process to you. We will publish every formula, every raw trial file, every piece of data. Nothing hidden. Nothing to hide." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a revolution. She wasn't just defending Horizon, she was tearing down the walls of corporate secrecy that had allowed the entire industry to flourish on exploitation and deceit. Within minutes, the hashtag #TransparentRx began trending. At first, it was a ripple, but soon it became a wave, a global movement for transparency in the pharmaceutical industry. Patients, families, doctors, and activists rallied behind Elena. People were tired of the lies, tired of being ignored while the big pharmaceutical companies raked in billions on the backs of the vulnerable. The response was overwhelming. Whistleblowers began to come forward, at first from Horizon, but then, to Elena's shock, from NextGen. Sales reps, lab technicians, even high-level executives within NextGen began leaking documents, sharing recordings, and speaking out about the corruption that had been allowed to fester within both companies. Voss's empire, built on lies and manipulation, began to crumble under the weight of the subpoenas. The walls were closing in. Investigations were launched not just into Horizon but into NextGen as well. Elena wasn't just holding her ground, she was tearing down the system that had allowed corporate greed to flourish at the cost of human lives. The media turned on Voss and the public's eyes were opened. The charade that had been NextGen's success story was unraveling in real time. The accusations of fake trial data, the unethical price hikes, the manipulation of patients, Voss had used those same tactics against Horizon, but now they were coming back to haunt him. The whistleblowers from NextGen exposed the same patterns of corruption that Elena had fought so hard to eradicate from Horizon. As Elena stood there, watching the momentum build, she knew this battle was far from over. But she was no longer just fighting for Horizon. She was fighting for an entire industry to be held accountable. For transparency. For truth. For the people who had been ignored, deceived, and betrayed by a system that had placed profits above lives. And as the world watched, as the hashtag #TransparentRx flooded every corner of social media, Elena realized that this was bigger than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just changing Horizon Pharma, she was igniting a movement that could reshape the entire pharmaceutical industry. Voss and NextGen's empire would fall, and Elena would be at the forefront of a new era. One where the truth was no longer optional. A year later, Elena stood beside Mrs. Delaney in a packed congressional hearing room, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. The sound of murmurs and camera shutters filled the space, but Elena barely noticed. Her focus was on the woman beside her, the woman whose life had changed in ways Elena had never expected when she first made the decision to fight back. Mrs. Delaney, though tired and worn from a lifetime of battles, stood tall, her face soft but determined. Beside Mrs. Delaney, Jake, now standing tall, his eyes clear and full of life, held up a small bottle of Horizon medication. The same drug that had once been a luxury, a financial burden, was now available to him for free. And he was no longer suffering. No longer enduring the daily fear of seizures that had stolen so much from him and his family. Jake's voice, calm and steady, cut through the room. "This isn't just medicine," he said, holding up the bottle for everyone to see. His eyes were focused, and his words carried the weight of everything they had fought for. "It's proof that people matter more than profits." The room was silent for a moment, and then the applause started. It was slow at first, hesitant, but it quickly grew into a resounding show of support. The impact of those words, the truth they carried, echoed throughout the chamber. This wasn't just about one person, one drug, or one company. It was about an entire industry learning to remember why it existed in the first place. Elena's chest tightened as she watched Jake, now so confident and full of hope. A year ago she had been fighting alone, isolated by her own mistakes, trying to repair a broken system. But now, standing in front of Congress with Mrs. Delaney and Jake, she knew the change had begun. This wasn't just a small victory, it was the beginning of something bigger. The committee members exchanged glances, many visibly moved by the young man's words. The fight wasn't over, but this moment felt like a turning point. The transparency, the accountability, everything Elena had risked, everything she had sacrificed was beginning to take shape. Her vision for Horizon, for the pharmaceutical industry, was finally becoming a reality. As the applause continued, Elena looked down at Mrs. Delaney, who gave her a quiet, grateful smile. Their journey had been long, but they had made it. Horizon had turned a corner, and with it, an entire industry was starting to change. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was a step in the right direction. Jake's voice interrupted her thoughts, steady and strong as ever. "This is what happens when you put people first," he said, his hand still clutching the pill bottle. "This is what happens when you care." Elena felt the lump in her throat. She had never been able to say it better herself. In this room with these people, she finally understood the real impact of the fight she had waged. It wasn't just about profits or market shares. It was about the people who depended on the medicine, on the healthcare, on the choices they made. The room was still alive with the energy of hope, the sound of change reverberating through every corner. The story of Horizon's transformation, of the lives it had touched, was just beginning to be told. And Elena was more determined than ever to see it through. Because, as Jake had so simply put it, people mattered more than profits. And this time, that truth would be the one that carried them forward. As the cameras flashed around her, capturing every moment of this historic day, Elena's eyes caught something unexpected in the crowd. There, near the back of the room, stood a figure wearing the very same lab scrubs she had once worn, scrubs still stained with coffee, still bearing the name Claire. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the woman. It was a reminder of where she had come from, of the long, uncertain road she had walked to get here. Claire, the intern, the mask she had worn to understand the truth of her own company. It had been a symbol of her willingness to step into the shadows and confront the system she had helped build, but now, standing in this bright spotlight, she saw it for what it truly was, a step toward redemption. She smiled softly, her gaze lingering on the scrubs. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried the weight of everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed. Redemption, she realized, wasn't a single act. It wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation or victory, it was an ongoing process. A prescription refilled daily, one decision at a time, one choice to put people before profits. The applause from the crowd was still echoing in her ears, but in that brief instant, Elena felt at peace. She had made mistakes, yes, and she had lost her way for a time, but now she was on the right path. And no matter how many times she stumbled, no matter how hard the road ahead might be, redemption would always be there, waiting for her to claim it again and again. She looked back at the crowd, at Jake and Mrs. Delaney, and at the committee members still wiping away tears. The fight wasn't over, but the battle had already changed. This moment was proof of that. And with each new day, Elena would continue to fight for the people who mattered most, not just for the company she had once built, but for a future where accountability, transparency, and humanity came first. As the flashbulbs popped and the world took notice, Elena knew that the real work was just beginning, but this time she was ready for it.